You think a pamphlet from a waiting room makes you a lawyer? Is that it? Judge Gerald Whitlock's voice cracked across the courtroom like a dropped plate. His gavel hung in his fist. Motionless. Threatening. The room held its breath. The woman in front of him didn't move a muscle. She pushed her thick tortoise-shell glasses up the bridge of her nose. I think, Your Honor, that the law applies to everyone in this room, including you. Whitlock threw his head back and laughed. A short, ugly bark that bounced off the high ceiling. I am the law in here. Sweetheart, I could have you in a holding cell in 15 seconds flat. Courtroom 6B of the Multnomah County Circuit Court. On the 3rd floor of the downtown Portland courthouse. Always carried a particular kind of heaviness in the air, the thick, stale weight of people who had nowhere else to go and no one else to call. But for Judge Gerald Whitlock, that same stale air was something closer to perfume. It smelled like power, and he breathed it in every single morning like he was the only man alive entitled to it, raised behind a slab of dark walnut. Looking down at the gallery from a riser most judges didn't need. Whitlock didn't see a hall of justice when he looked out at his courtroom. He saw a kingdom. At 52, he was the textbook picture of inherited comfort, silver hair, combed into a part so sharp it looked drawn with a ruler. Robes tailored just loosely enough to hide a few too many steak dinners at the club. Behind him hung a careful foot above eye level so that no one could miss it. Sat his framed diploma from Hawthorne College of Law. A credential. His family's name on a library wing had done more to secure than any exam score ever had. Whitlock had never once, in his entire life, been told no and meant it. It showed in the way his mouth always seemed to be curling. Just slightly. Like he was tasting something sour and enjoying it. He didn't preside over his courtroom. He ruled it. It was a grey, drizzling Thursday. And the morning docket was stacked with what Whitlock privately called the city's leftovers evictions. Fender-bender disputes, unpaid utility judgments, parking violations. To him, these weren't people with problems. They were a line of inconveniences, standing between him and his 11:30 lunch reservation at the yacht club. Next. Whitlock snapped without looking up from the small screen, tucked just out of camera range, where he was quietly watching a stock ticker crawl by. And keep it short. I don't have all morning for sob stories. The gallery sat frozen, in that particular kind of silence that only forms around people who are afraid to be noticed. The bailiff stood like carved stone, long used to the judge's moods, swinging like a weather vane. The court reporter, a young woman named Marisol Vega, kept her eyes locked on her stenography machine, careful never to catch his gaze. Whitlock's reputation traveled well beyond the courthouse walls. He was, by every account that mattered, a bully warm and golden toward corporate attorneys who spoke his language and golfed at his club, and merciless toward anyone unrepresented who stumbled over a legal term. Earlier that same morning he'd reduced a young mother newly arrived from Manila, her English still rough at the edges, to tears on the stand simply for filing her eviction paperwork a day late. Cruelty, to Whitlock, was a management style. Fear was the only language he believed the people in his gallery understood. Bailiff. Did you hear me? Whitlock barked, his voice snapping against the acoustic tile overhead. Call the next case before I hold this whole room in contempt out of sheer boredom. Case number 25SC04417. The bailiff announced, Ironwood Recovery and Storage versus Dorothy Webb. Defendant is present. Correction. Your Honor. Defendant is being represented by a proxy. Whitlock finally looked up, his eyes narrowing. He hated proxies. He hated amateurs, trying to play attorney even more. Well, step up to the podium. Then, speak into the microphone. I'm not deaf. Though God knows this job makes me wish I were. From the back row of the gallery, a figure rose, She was almost aggressively unremarkable, a deep burgundy cardigan over a plain cream blouse, dark slacks. Her hair cropped short and natural, not a single curl out of place. She carried a worn olive canvas messenger bag, slung across one shoulder, the kind that had clearly logged a decade of hard use. She walked down the center aisle slowly, with a kind of unhurried, deliberate grace that to a more observant man would have read as quiet, settled power. But Whitlock was not an observant man. He was a prejudiced one. He saw a middle-aged black woman in a thrift store cardigan, standing in for a relative over a $600 towing dispute against a company whose attorney he occasionally shared a cigar with after hours. He leaned back, fingers steepled, a satisfied little smirk pulling at the edge of his mouth. This was going to be easy. This was going to be fun. State your name for the record. Hisail, performing exhaustion for the benefit of the smirking corporate lawyer at the plaintiff's table. The woman reached the podium. No nervous shuffling of papers. No clearing of her throat. She simply looked up, and her dark, calm eyes met his pale ones without flinching. "My name is Renee," she said. Her voice was soft but carried clean to the back wall. "I'm appearing on behalf of my aunt, Dorothy Webb, regarding an unlawful vehicle seizure by Ironwood Recovery and Storage." Whitlock scoffed, rolling his eyes dramatically toward the plaintiff's table, where attorney Connor Bishop sat in a suit that probably cost more than Dorothy Webb's monthly rent. Unlawful seizure. Oh, we've got a legal scholar in the house. This should be entertaining. Go ahead. Renee, but keep it under 3 minutes. My patience is already thin enough to read through. Renee did not take the bait. The sneer, the mocking tone around her own name, the eye roll for the gallery. She absorbed it all with the stillness of a granite outcrop weathering a light rain. She opened her canvas bag and pulled out a single, neatly tabbed folder. On the evening of October 12th, she began, her tone level. Ironwood Recovery removed my aunt's vehicle from a legally designated residential parking zone. Under Oregon Revised Statutes, Section 98, 260, governing commercial relocation of vehicles deemed trespassing. Stop. Whitlock held up a manicured hand, leaning forward with exaggerated disbelief. Did you really just walk into my courtroom and try to quote the Oregon Revised Statutes at me? I'm establishing the legal basis for the defense. Your Honor, Renee replied evenly. The statute requires posted warning signage at least 48 hours before a residential tow. We have time-stamped photographic evidence that Ironwood's temporary no parking sign was installed roughly 3 hours after the vehicle had already been towed. Connor Bishop shot to his feet. Objection. Your Honor. Hearsay. The defendant isn't a sworn witness. And she's certainly not counsel of record. She's a relative trying to save herself a court fee. Sustained, Whitlock said, slamming his gavel down lightly for effect. Then looking at Renee with theatrical pity. Look, Renee, I get it. You probably spent last night marathoning courtroom dramas and Googling legal terms. But that's not how the real world works. You don't get to walk in here with a phone photo and accuse a legitimate business of theft. With respect, Your Honor, Renee said, her voice dropping a fraction. Cooling. The rules of civil procedure permit submission of time-stamped metadata as evidentiary exhibits in small claims matters. This isn't hearsay. It's digital forensics. I'd also note that Ironwood Recovery has a documented pattern of aggressive towing in this particular zip code, a zip code that happens to be predominantly lower income. A flush of color crept up Whitlock's neck. The nerve of this woman. She wasn't cowering. She wasn't begging. She was pushing back, and worse. She was quietly pointing at the exact bias baked into the system. His system. Are you accusing this court of bias? Ma'am, he demanded, his voice climbing. bouncing off the oak paneling. I'm stating facts about the plaintiff's business practices. Renee said, entirely unbothered by the volume. Facts that are directly relevant to whether this court should grant their motion. I decide what's relevant in my courtroom. Whitlock roared. The gallery flinched as one body. Marisol's fingers blurred across her keys. You're bordering on contempt. Ma'am. You stand there in your little cardigan with your little folder, thinking you can debate jurisprudence with a man who graduated near the top of his class at Hawthorne. Renee looked at him for a long, quiet beat. The silence stretched thin enough to snap. Her gaze drifted to the framed diploma on the wall behind him. Then back to his reddening face. A law degree is a privilege. Your Honor, she said softly, but it doesn't grant a judge license to ignore statutory law. Nor does it excuse a lack of judicial temperament. The Oregon Code of Judicial Conduct, Rule 3, San, requires a judge to be patient, dignified, and courteous to every litigant who appears before them. The courtroom let out a single collective, silent gasp. Connor Bishop actually dropped his pen. Whitlock stared at her, genuinely stunned for half a second. No one talked to him like this. Attorneys with 30 years of practice softened their voices around him. City council members asked for his blessing at fundraisers. And here was this nobody, this woman in a thrift store cardigan, quoting the Judicial Conduct Code back at him like a disappointed schoolteacher. The shock curdled fast into rage. He was going to bury her. He'd make an example so brutal that no one in this city would dare cross him again. He'd have her spend the weekend in a holding cell just to teach her a lesson about respect. Arends were clever, he whispered, venom dripping from every syllable. You think a pamphlet from a waiting room makes you a lawyer? Is that it? Renee adjusted her glasses. I think, Your Honor, that the law applies to everyone in this room, including you. Whitlock threw his head back and laughed aloud. Performative bark. Designed to humiliate. He glanced toward Bishop, inviting him to join in. And the attorney offered a thin, obedient chuckle. A couple of bailiffs, trained to follow his lead, let smirks creep onto their faces. Oh, the law applies to me. Whitlock mocked, wiping an imaginary tear from his eye. Sweetheart, I am the law in here. When I'm sitting in this chair, my word is final. If I say the sky is green, it's green. If I say Ironwood owns your aunt's rust bucket, they own it. And if I decide you're a disruptive little nuisance, I can have you in cuffs in 15 seconds. Renee stood perfectly still. To Whitlock, her stillness read as the shock of a cornered animal. In reality, it was the patience of someone watching an opponent walk, step by step, into a trap of his own making. Is that your official legal standard? Your Honor, she asked, that your personal word outranks the written statutes of the state of Oregon. I just want to make sure the court reporter has that exact philosophy on the record. Whitlock's eyes snapped to Marisol. Strike that exchange. Marisol, do not strike it, Renee said, and her voice cracked through the room with sudden, startling authority. Marisol's fingers froze over the keys. Caught between two opposing orders. Excuse me, Whitlock spat, half rising from his chair. Did you just give an order to my clerk in my own courtroom? I'm reminding the court of its legal obligations, Renee said, her gaze locking onto him like a laser sight. Under the Oregon Court Reporting Practices Act, a judge cannot unilaterally order a record struck simply because he's just admitted, on the record, to abusing his authority. Whitlock was nearly hyperventilating now, the veins at his collar standing out in sharp relief. You insolent. I have dealt with 1,000 people exactly like you. People who think the system owes them something. You walk in here with your entitlement, thinking you can outsmart a man who's given his whole life to the law. You are nothing. You're a stand-in for a deadbeat who couldn't be bothered to read a parking sign. And you think you can dictate procedure in my kingdom? He thrust a trembling finger toward the bailiffs. Bring out the cuffs. I'm citing this woman for direct criminal contempt. 15 days in county. Effective right now. The two bailiffs near the back wall hesitated. Something about the moment felt deeply, fundamentally wrong. The woman wasn't shouting. She wasn't combative. She wasn't even sweating. She radiated a calm that didn't belong in a room about to descend into chaos. Your Honor, Renee said, her voice dropping into something low and deliberate. Before you sign that order, I'd strongly recommend you review the precedent set in reconduct of Hartley. Direct criminal contempt requires conduct calculated to obstruct the court. Citing a statute and asking for it to be enforced fairly isn't obstruction. Your Honor, it's the opposite of obstruction. I don't care about Hartley. Whitlock screamed. All pretense of professionalism gone. I don't care about your little citations and your little codes. You walk into my courtroom dressed like you're heading to a church potluck, and you disrespect me. Me, I know exactly what you are. You think a few buzzwords make you untouchable. I'm about to show you what real power looks like. Bailiffs, I said, cuff her. As the bailiffs took a reluctant step forward, boots thudding heavy against the carpet, Renee reached calmly into her canvas bag. Watch her hands. Whitlock barked. Suddenly paranoid. She could have something in there. What Renee pulled out was a pair of sleek black reading glasses and a slim, silver-edged badge case. She set them down, deliberately, on the wooden podium. The faint clack of the case against wood seemed to echo through the silent room. I don't have a weapon. Judge Whitlock, Renee said, her tone sliding from polite civilian to something colder, more commanding. But I do have an explanation. The room had gone so quiet, you could hear the hum of the fluorescent panels overhead. The bailiffs had stopped mid-stride. Connor Bishop was staring at the faint silver crest embossed on the case, even from 15 feet away. The shape of it was unmistakable. The seal of the state of Oregon. Whitlock, blinded by his own fury, saw none of it. He assumed it was some prop, some sovereign citizen bluff, a last desperate move. What is that? He sneered. A library card, your ACLU membership. Put your hands behind your back. You're done here. Before I do, Renee said, opening the case, but keeping it angled toward herself. I'd like to ask you a few direct questions. Judge Whitlock, and I'd like your answers on the record. For posterity. I don't answer to you. Whitlock scoffed. Oh. But you do. Renee said smoothly. Rule 3. 3 of the Code of Judicial Conduct requires impartiality and fairness from every judge in this state. You just stated, on the record, that you've dealt with 1,000 people exactly like me. Could you clarify? For the record, what exactly you mean by my type? Whitlock grinned. A feral. Satisfied grin. He was going to enjoy destroying her. People who go looking for loopholes instead of taking responsibility. He said, people who think the rules of society don't apply to them because they can scream discrimination at the first inconvenience. I see. Renee said, her expression unreadable. And you also stated that you don't care about the statutes or precedents I cited, that your word supersedes the law. Is it your standard practice in this courtroom to disregard Oregon statute whenever it conflicts with your personal mood? My judgment. Whitlock corrected, puffing out his chest. Honed by decades of education and experience, I know a frivolous case when I see one. I know a liar when one's standing in front of me. I don't need a statute book to tell me your aunt was illegally parked and that you're here wasting taxpayer money. Even when presented with photographic evidence to the contrary, evidence can be doctored. He waved a hand. My instincts can't. I'm the gatekeeper in this room. And my gut says you're guilty. Your aunt's guilty. Ironwood gets their money. Are you finished with your little deposition? Or do I add another 15 days for wasting my time? Renee slowly closed the badge case. A faint, almost imperceptible smile touched the corner of her mouth. Not joy, but the quiet satisfaction of a predator that had finally watched its prey wander into a corner with no exit. I have everything I need. Judge Whitlock, she said softly. Marisol, did you get all of that? The court reporter, hands trembling, nodded. Yes. Ma'am. Good. Renee straightened. Enough of this circus. Whitlock snapped, slamming his gavel hard enough to dent the wood. Bailiffs. If she's not in cuffs in 5 seconds, you'll be joining her in a holding cell. A bailiff stepped forward, reaching for Renee's arm. I wouldn't do that. Officer. A deep voice rolled from the back of the room. Every head turned. The heavy double doors at the rear of the courtroom swung open. 2 men in dark, immaculately tailored suits and discreet earpieces strode in, moving with the kind of synchronized precision that belonged to people trained for far more dangerous rooms than this one. Behind them walked a man Whitlock recognized instantly, Judge Harold Atwell, the presiding administrative judge for the entire county. A man who held more sway over Whitlock's career than anyone alive. Atwell looked pale, sweating, his eyes darting nervously toward the podium where Renee stood. Judge Atwell. Whitlock stammered, his bravado collapsing in real time. What brings you to my courtroom? Atwell didn't even glance at him. He walked briskly down the center aisle, brushing past the stunned bailiffs, and stopped a respectful distance from Renee. To Whitlock's absolute horror, the administrative judge of the county bowed his head. My apologies for the interruption. Chief Justice, Atwell said, his voice unsteady. Security flagged a delay in your schedule. Is everything all right? Whitlock's brain simply stalled. Chief Justice Renee reached down, picked up the silver-edged badge case, and flipped it open toward the bench. The seal caught the overhead light. Above it sat a photograph and a title that drained every drop of color from Gerald Whitlock's face. Renee R. Callaway, Chief Justice, Oregon Supreme Court. The silence that followed was total, the kind of silence that comes right before a shockwave hits. Whitlock blinked. Ions. Twice. His throat suddenly dry as chalk. I don't understand. Renee unbuttoned the top of her burgundy cardigan, and in that single motion, the unassuming woman who had walked into the room 20 minutes earlier seemed to disappear entirely. In her place stood someone radiating the full, settled weight of judicial authority. Let me help you understand. Judge Whitlock. Chief Justice Camille Ashworth, known to her staff as Renee Callaway when she wanted to disappear into a crowd, said, her voice carrying easily to every corner of the room. Over the past 9 months, the Judicial Fitness Board has received 27 separate complaints about your conduct on this bench. Complaints of racial bias, economic discrimination, blatant disregard for due process, and verbal abuse of unrepresented litigants. Whitlock gripped the edge of his bench. Knuckles, bone white. The room seemed to tilt under him. He'd gone to Hawthorne. He played squash with the mayor's chief of staff. This wasn't supposed to happen to men like him. Normally the board sends an investigator. She continued, pacing slowly in front of the podium, commanding the space without raising her voice an inch. But when I read the complaint file, when I saw, line by line, how systematically you dismantled the dignity of the people you're sworn to serve, I decided I needed to witness it myself. I needed to know whether a sitting judge in this state was truly as far gone as the file suggested. She looked directly into his terrified eyes. My Aunt Dorothy is a real person. Her car really was towed. But I stood in for her today to see exactly how you treat someone you believe has no power, no money, and no one to call. Chief Justice, Whitlock stammered, rising, his knees knocking audibly against the desk. I had no idea who you were. If you'd known. She cut in, her voice now sharp as a struck bell. That is precisely the point. Gerald, justice doesn't depend on rank. It shouldn't matter whether the person standing in front of you is the Chief Justice of this state or a single mother working 3 jobs. The law guarantees equal treatment. You don't extend dignity to people because of their title. You extend it because they're human beings standing in a court of law. Connor Bishop had begun quietly sliding his chair backward, attempting to put as much physical distance as possible between himself and the fallout. You confessed, on the record, to disregarding statute, Ashworth said, ticking the points off on her fingers. You confessed to basing rulings on personal bias. You ordered a court reporter to alter an official transcript to cover your tracks. And you attempted to jail a citizen without due process for the simple act of citing the law accurately. You didn't bend the code of judicial conduct. Gerald, you shattered it. On the record. Whitlock turned desperately toward Atwell. Harold, please. You know me. We've known each other for 15 years. It was a bad morning, the docket. The stress. Atwell took a step backward, both hands raised. Do not look at me. Gerald, you're on your own. Ashworth turned to the trembling court reporter. Marisol, I want this morning's full transcript expedited and securely sent to the fitness board by end of day. Yes, Chief Justice, Marisol said, sitting up a little straighter, something like quiet vindication crossing her face. Ashworth turned back to the bench. Gerald Whitlock, by the authority vested in me as Chief Justice of the Oregon Supreme Court, in conjunction with the emergency powers of the Judicial Fitness Board, you are hereby suspended from the bench, effective immediately, pending a full evidentiary hearing on your removal and disbarment. Whitlock gasped, one hand flying to his chest. You can't, just, I can. Ashworth said quietly, and I just did. What followed happened fast, and with a kind of surgical, almost merciful precision. Officers, Ashworth said, turning to the 2 bailiffs, who, minutes earlier, had nearly handcuffed her. Escort Mr. Whitlock to his chambers to collect his personal effects. Then escort him out of this building. He's no longer authorized in any restricted area of this courthouse. The bailiffs, visibly relieved, they hadn't actually arrested the highest-ranking judge in the state, moved with sudden, efficient speed. Sir, stepped down from the bench. One of them said, his voice now entirely stripped of the deference he'd shown Whitlock all morning. Whitlock looked, in that moment, like something deflating. His robes, moments ago a symbol of total command, now hung on him like a costume, 2 sizes, too large. He stumbled down from the riser, hands shaking. He looked out at the gallery, the people he'd terrorized for years. The immigrants, the working poor, the unrepresented, and found them watching him with wide, unguarded eyes. Some were smiling. The young mother he'd reduced to tears that very morning sat with a hand pressed over her mouth, tears welling for an entirely different reason now. My pension, Whitlock mumbled, almost to himself, as a bailiff took his arm. My career, my family's name, as he was marched, humiliated, out of the very room he'd ruled like a private fiefdom. Chief Justice Ashworth turned to Atwell. Judge Atwell, assign a replacement to this docket immediately. I want a full review of every summary judgment Whitlock has issued in the past 5 years. If we find he's been systematically favoring corporate plaintiffs over unrepresented defendants, this becomes a federal civil rights matter. Yes, Chief Justice. Right away. Atwell nodded. wiping sweat from his brow. She turned next to the visibly shaken bishop. As for Ironwood recovery, this case is dismissed with prejudice. You can tell your client the Attorney General's office will be receiving my personal recommendation to audit their towing practices across this district. If they towed my aunt illegally, I'd hate to imagine how many other people in this city they've quietly stolen from. Bishop swallowed hard, packing his briefcase with unsteady hands. Understood, Your Honor. Ashworth picked up her worn canvas bag and buttoned her cardigan back into place. In an instant, the commanding figure folded itself away, and she was, once again, simply a woman in a burgundy cardigan. But the air in the room had changed completely lighter, cleaner, as though a long-held weight had finally been set down. As she walked toward the doors, the gallery parted for her without being asked. Every face turned with something like reverence. At the threshold, Marisol called out softly, "Chief Justice." Ashworth turned. "Thank you," Marisol whispered, speaking. In that moment, for every person Whitlock had ever crushed in that room, Ashworth offered a small, genuine smile. The law is a shield. Marisol, don't ever let anyone convince you it's only a sword. By that afternoon, the story had already leaked. By evening, the transcript had reached the local news. Within days, the footage of an arrogant, third-generation judge attempting to jail the Chief Justice of his own state's Supreme Court had become a national headline. Whitlock's photo ran on every local broadcast. His yacht club quietly revoked his membership before the scandal could attach itself to their name. The friends who used to return his calls within the hour stopped answering altogether. 3 months later, stripped of his robe, formally disbarred, and thoroughly disgraced, Gerald Whitlock was pushed into an early, pensionless retirement, left with nothing but a framed diploma from a law school that no longer wanted his name associated with it, and the bitter taste of consequences he never believed could reach him. Karma, it turned out, didn't need a gavel of her own. She'd simply worn a burgundy cardigan and waited for him to talk himself into a corner.